Hello and welcome to Compliance Briefs on Firm-Wide Risk-Based Approach. This presentation focuses on firm-wide risk assessment, covering the regulatory framework and the scope of requirements. We will explore the key elements of a risk-based approach at RBA, including the timing of firm-wide risk assessments and a step-by-step process for conducting them at a firm level. Additionally, we will discuss how to identify, assess, and mitigate risks, as well as how to evaluate and update a firm's policies, procedures, and controls to ensure effectiveness. We will also review common findings from thematic off-site monitoring reviews, highlighting areas where firms often fall short. Finally, we will introduce the resources provided by ICPAC to support firms in implementing an effective risk-based approach. The obligation to conduct a firm-wide risk assessment is established under Article 58A of the Prevention and Suppression of Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Law, 188, I, 2007. This provision mandates that obliged entities take appropriate steps to identify and assess the risks of money laundering and terrorist financing they face. These assessments must consider various risk areas, including those related to clients, countries and geographical areas, products, services, transactions, and delivery channels. Risk assessment exercises are also required at supervisor level, and ICPAC is required to identify and assess the risk of money laundering and terrorist financing the firms it supervises is subject to. At a national level, the advisory authority coordinates the competent public services and the private sector bodies for the identification, assessment, understanding, and mitigation of the risks from illegal activities and terrorist financing. This process contributes to the development of the country's national risk assessment. A firm-wide risk assessment should be performed to assess the risk of the firm's exposure to money laundering, terrorists financing, proliferation financing, and sanctions. Although one consolidated assessment could be performed for all types of risk, firms should make sure they identify and assess the sanctions risk appropriately and sufficiently, as the assessment might significantly differ. Furthermore, the extent of risk assessment performed by the firm should be proportionate to the firm's size and nature. A risk-based approach entails targeted measures and procedures, including identifying and assessing risks related to money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing, and sanctions faced by the firm. The risk should be based on specific client profiles, services provided by the firm, geographical regions, and operational delivery channels for the firm and its clients. Documenting the firm's risk management policies, procedures, and controls within a comprehensive manual, ensuring their consistent application across the firm by individuals appointed by the board of directors, the partners, or sole practitioner. Managing and mitigating identified risks by implementing effective, appropriate controls and measures. Continuously monitoring and refining policies, procedures, and controls to enhance their effectiveness over time. This assessment should cover the entire firm, and it is initially conducted upon the adoption of the risk-based approach framework and repeated annually. It is then reviewed regularly and updated whenever significant internal or external triggering changes arise. The assessment consolidates results of the assessments of individual client relationships and transactions, providing a holistic view of the firm's overall risk profile. Conducting a risk assessment at the firm level generally involves four critical steps. The first step is to identify the risks related to money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing, and sanctions. This includes identifying the services offered by the firm, the jurisdictions in which its clients operate in, the clients they attract, and the transaction or delivery channels they use to serve those clients. Essentially, the firm must identify the potential risks that its operations could be exploited for illicit activities, such as money laundering, terrorist financing, or proliferation financing. It is important to note that the steps taken to identify and assess these risks should be proportionate to the firm's size and nature. For example, firms that offer non-complex services that do not obscure transparency or have predominantly local clients with minimal international exposure may not require an overly complex or sophisticated risk assessment. The second step involves assessing each identified risk, considering both the likelihood of its occurrence and the potential impact if it were to materialize. Following this, appropriate measures and controls must be designed and implemented to mitigate the identified risks and reduce them to an acceptable level. Finally, the implemented measures and controls should undergo regular reviews and monitoring. At this stage, a comprehensive risk assessment will be conducted to identify and evaluate the inherent risks faced by the firm. Inherent risk refers to the level of risk that exists in a process, activity, or business operation before any mitigating controls are applied. The assessment should begin with a holistic review of the firm's business as a whole, to understand its exposure to money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing, and sanctions risks. The firm must assess vulnerabilities that could lead to exploitation for illicit purposes, such as money laundering, sanctions evasion, or the financing of terrorist organizations or weapons proliferation networks. For example, money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing risks may arise from the use of complex corporate structures that obscure beneficial ownership or the use of client accounts to facilitate illicit transactions. Sanctions risks may emerge when the firm engages with clients, transactions, or business partners connected to sanctioned jurisdictions, entities, or individuals and who request intermediary services as part of their circumvention techniques, for example processing payments to jurisdictions that do not comply with sanctions regulations. The nature, size, complexity, and scope of the firm's operation significantly influence its risk exposure. Firms operating in multiple jurisdictions, high-risk industries, or offering complex financial products may face increased risks. To assess customer-related risks, the firm should categorize clients into types of client, for example by legal form, size, etc., and attach a risk to each client type. Special attention should be given to relationships involving politically exposed persons, PEPs, high net worth individuals, and clients operating in high-risk industries. Clients linked to sanctioned entities, countries, or sectors should be closely monitored to mitigate sanctions-related risks. Country risk assessment should extend beyond the physical location of customers to include the countries the firm and its clients and their counterparties have links to, through trade, ownership structures, outsourcing agreements, networks, intermediaries, etc. Once the countries have been identified, the firm should assign a risk rating on these jurisdictions drawing information from reliable sources such as the FATF list of high-risk and non-cooperative jurisdictions, the EU sanctions map, the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, etc. Certain products and services inherently carry a higher risk of money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing, or sanctions violations. The firm should identify all products and services it offers and consider whether the services allow for a degree of anonymity, transparency of the beneficial owner as well as the source of funds, source of wealth of the clients, or whether they allow for payments to or from third parties and accordingly attach a level of risk to each service line. High-risk products services may include cross-border payments, digital asset services, administrative services, which can be misused for illicit purposes. The method of delivering products and services significantly affects risk levels as it could make it more difficult to verify the client's identity and activity. Non-face-to-face interactions, online transactions, or the use of intermediaries can increase the risk of illicit activities. After identifying the risks, the next step is to design and document the risk assessment methodology, clearly outlining how the level of risk will be determined. This methodology should consider both the identified risk factors and the firm's experience, nature, size, and complexity. It is then necessary to assign a level or score to each risk using a tailored approach that aligns with the size and type of the business. In general, assessing risk involves determining the likelihood of the risk occurring, i.e. between likely and unlikely, and cross-referencing it with the potential impact or consequence if it does occur. Professional judgment plays a crucial role in this process. Typically, the impact is measured by considering factors such as potential criminal proceedings, regulatory or supervisory actions, financial loss, and reputational damage. By cross-referencing the likelihood with the impact, the the resulting risk level can be effectively determined. As a rule, severe impact with a high likelihood of risk occurring will conclude a high risk, and respectively a risk unlikely to happen with a low impact will conclude a low risk. Each firm may choose its risk categories accordingly. Following the identification and assessment of the risks faced by the firm, it is crucial to implement appropriate and proportional measures to effectively address these risks. Indicative mitigating measures include determining risk appetite. Based on the risk assessment and the identification of high-risk areas, the firm may conclude that certain products, services, or characteristics of business relationships pose risks that are too high to be acceptable or tolerable. Designing effective policies, procedures, and controls. Policies should outline what the firm intends to achieve, controls should specify the checks and measures necessary to ensure compliance, and procedures should detail how the specific measures and controls will be implemented. Tailoring procedures to identified risks. Procedures should be commensurate with the identified risks. For example, the risk assessment may highlight areas where simplified due diligence is adequate or appropriate, or areas where enhanced due diligence is required. Customizing training and awareness programs. Training should align with the identified risk areas. Personnel involved in high-risk business areas or offering high-risk products or services should receive additional, detailed, and targeted training relevant to those risks. Independent review of higher-risk business relationships. This includes setting up independent assessments and reviews for higher-risk business relationships, separate from the individuals managing those relationships. Regularly update risk management protocols. Procedures should be in place to ensure that risk assessments, policies, procedures, and controls are regularly updated to remain relevant and commensurate with the actual risks faced by the firm. You should perform regular examinations of the effectiveness and adequacy of the established policies, procedures, and controls, as well as check their implementation. The results of the review should be documented and be readily available to ICPAC upon request or during the AML/CFT monitoring visits. You must regularly review the risk assessment to ensure that it always remains relevant and up to date. In order to achieve this, the review should take into consideration and incorporate any internal information relating to existing business relationships, i.e., information from any internal reports made of suspicious activities transaction, also information on new trends and emerging risks and new technologies. It should stay in line with legal updates and requirements, be aware of law enforcement alerts, reports and updates, and incorporate the findings of the national risk assessments and supranational risk assessments. During thematic off-site reviews, several common weaknesses were identified in firm-wide risk assessments. One of the key issues was the use of generic or insufficient data, which often failed to reflect the firm's specific characteristics, making the risk assessment irrelevant. Additionally, many firms had outdated and static risk assessments that did not incorporate recent threats, vulnerabilities, or industry trends, such as services provided to designated persons or the impact of electronic identification on due diligence. Another significant weakness was the incomplete identification of risk factors. Many assessments failed to consider all elements affecting risk exposure, such as jurisdictional proximity to sanctioned countries or industries prone to corruption and bribery. Moreover, transaction risk was frequently overlooked, despite its relevance in certain services like directorship roles or holding client assets. A critical gap was the lack of corresponding mitigation measures. Even when risks were identified, firms often failed to implement appropriate controls to reduce exposure. Lastly, there was an absence of residual risk assessment, where firms merely referenced residual risk without evaluating the effectiveness of their controls or determining if the remaining risk was manageable and aligned with their risk appetite. These weaknesses highlight the need for firms to enhance their risk assessment processes to ensure they are comprehensive, dynamic, and effectively mitigate identified risks. ICPAC offers a number of guidance notes on its website, including a guidance on AML/CFT firm-wide risk-based approach and a sanctioned firm-wide risk-based approach. Both guidance papers include a template that can be used as a starting point for all firms to draft their first firm-wide risk assessment. ICPAC has also prepared a report on the common findings identified during the off-site thematic reviews of firm-wide risk assessments that can help firms when preparing or updating their own risk assessment. I hope you found this useful. For any queries, you may contact us at compliance@icpac.org.cy. Thank you and goodbye.